So we are now going to move to our next session, and welcome to the stage Hadrien, Gardeur and Gautier Chomel, who are going to tell us about actions that can be taken by providers and publishers in order to improve the creation of metadata and the production pipeline for natively accessible content. So thank you.
Hello and welcome to our talk about accessibility workflow, easy and high-impact item actions. We are willing to inspire you and your team to take next steps on the road of a fully accessible reading future. I am Gautier Chomel. I work at EDRLab as a project manager, and I have a background in book production for all kinds of books. I am with Hadrien Gardeur, long-timer of the digital publishing landscape and initiator of the EDRLab experience almost 10 years ago. Before any production action, it is necessary to know what we want to achieve, and accessibility can be defined in many ways. Most of them, unfortunately, are very technical, like compliant with WCAG or similar stuff, that are describing, in fact, the means of achieving accessibility. It's a crucial necessity for the technical team, but it's not very usable for stakeholders or readers. Within this talk, we will define accessibility with a user-centric view. Let's see. Yes, wonderful. We have a remote control working. From that user-centric view, from that perspective, accessibility is nothing more than how people read. And that's different from one person to another. We usually don't take much attention with that, but when we're speaking about print disabled person, we have three main known reading ways. Visual, with adjustments, generated speech, and assistive technology users. For a comfortable visual reading, you rely on dynamic modification of text style and layout aspects that includes the possibility to change fonts, size, colors, margins, spaces, justification, etc. For a good read aloud experience, you rely on choice of voices, highlights, rate, speech ratio, and your experience is affected by availability of caption, clean view, skippability, split text, etc. Must has still to be discovered on how read aloud can be much better reading experience than today. For assistive technology users, most known being screen reader users, they are usually used to output Braille and audio, sometimes at the same time. For them, the reading experience, the good reading experience, relies on structure extraction, including heading navigation. And to serve them well, it's important to have defined roles and states, along with option to set up verbosity and feedbacks, among others. The next two slides are short videos illustrating those functionality for those of the audience who get better understanding with visual support. But I'm not sure if I can. Yeah. So here we see reflowable EPUB that is being adjusted visually with changing of theme, neutral sepia night, and we'll apply some customization of text formatting, so font size, changing the font. This is almost well known of each of you, but it's always good to have reminders of such things. We can also adjust margins, word spacing, letter spacing, paragraph spacing, and line spacing. When it comes to read aloud, you have here option of caption clean view, skippability, and split text. There's no sound on this one, so I will pass because we don't have. so much experience. Okay. I don't know why. Okay. This one has sound.
Main and mark list. Settings toggle. Toggle button not pressed collapsed sub. Table of contents prop page. Table of better heading level 1 link start reading. List with 9 items heading level 2 link zoom. Link search in a book.
So it has sound, but the experience is not very good. It was supposed to illustrate how screenreaders are acting, and you've heard that before any item is mentioning what the structure is, so heading 1, heading 2, etc. I promise I'll make a better video and put it online, so you will have it available. On the screen, aside from the visual reading, aside from the hearing experience, there was a written view of what the screenreader is speaking. That's represent what happens on a Braille display. Okay, so now we'll see 2 case studies relating to assessing how your book can fit those needs. Hadrien, please.
Okay, thanks. So I think it was a very useful reminder of what the experience of working with Accessible is. We often talk about screen readers, but it's very important to remind ourselves that other features like read aloud or the ability to control the text are extremely important for different audience. And if you really want to fulfill the dream that was introduced by George very brightly, I think you need to think about all those things. To do that, you need accessible content, but to do that, you also need accessible metadata, because it's important for us to have content that works with those features, but it's also quite important to be able to advertise that those features are going to be available. So the rest of the presentation is going to be mostly on, are we advertising those correctly? And if not, what can we do to do a better job at advertising them? So actually, last October in Frankfurt, I presented a number of interesting data. So I looked into over 2 million different EPUB files. So that was a coverage on a lot of French content, a lot of US content, a lot of Spanish, Italian content. So, you know, not global, but still a pretty decent amount. And one thing that came out by investigating the content is that there's a major discrepancy between what is sent in ONIX, which is how most retailers, most libraries receive metadata, and what is actually in those EPUB files. So as you can see here on the screen, only 3% of publication had any accessibility metadata whatsoever. And when I say whatsoever, it's even indication about a table of content. So I wasn't asking much when looking at that. But then doing the same thing on EPUB, we saw that there were 3 times more data. So 9%. And then just trying to infer the same thing, we could very quickly see that actually most EPUB had at least something. It wasn't necessarily what you would call fully natively accessible, but they were at least something that could be of use, but none of that information went through either in EPUB metadata and even worse in ONIX metadata. So I think it was one of the first time we really had a look. It's just a glimpse because, of course, it's just 2 million files. It's not the entire EPUB market out there. But it's quite interesting to see those kind of numbers. And the good news is it's pretty easy to do something about that. It's very easy to do something about that because, well, first of all, it's possible to improve that by just sending the metadata in ONIX. And the even better news is that ONIX actually has made quite a lot of improvements when it comes to accessibility metadata. So when I looked at those numbers, it wasn't possible yet to send everything ONIX, but now it is. So today it is actually possible to send every accessibility metadata that really matters the most in ONIX. So the one key recommendation I would make, probably the most important one, is please do so. Send everything you have in ONIX. I know it's new ONIX code. You have to, find them up, and they're hidden in lists. But yeah, it's very important because it's actually what people receive, and that's what then enable, affordances and telling people, yes, you will be able to use those files. So first recommendation. Second recommendation, well, how come we have 3 times more metadata in EPUB than we do in ONIX? Maybe there's something to do there. So extracting metadata from EPUB, I think, is something that needs to be considered. Oftentimes, many distributors, aggregators, publishers, the EPUB metadata is like something that's like, oh, don't look. It doesn't look nice if you look in there. It's not updated, or it's not the best. But it seems that at least for accessibility, it is actually better than what we get in ONIX today. So I think a lot of publishers, for their own systems, a lot of distributors should look into that, the ability to extract those metadata and send them. Because if they're not sent, then no one will be able to display them. So I think that's another second recommendation that we're making here. The third one I know is a little more dangerous, but I think up to some point, there are also some possibilities in terms of inferences. It's impossible to say, you cannot infer that a book is accessible. But by looking at what a publication contains, they are useful information. Does this book contain images? Does this book, there's quite a table of contents, page navigation. So you can actually infer those information by looking at the content of a publication. And as we'll see a little bit later down the presentation, there are actually means of doing that pretty easily in an automated way now. So first set of recommendation. The other topic we talk about, I think a whole lot, are alternate descriptions. So whenever we hear and talk about the incoming European Accessibility Act, there are always very frightening numbers for publishers. Like, oh, it's going to cost you dozens or hundreds of millions to handle alternate descriptions. And the reality is, it's all guesswork, because it's almost impossible for everyone to know what you really need to do. And more specifically, I think you need, first of all, to look at, well, do I have books in my collection that are entirely textual? So we've also looked at those numbers, and that was also quite interesting. So back then, it was not possible in ONIX to send that information if a book is entirely accessible using text. But we actually saw that there was a bit more than expected number of EPUB that were sending information, about 5% of them. But by inspecting EPUB, by checking for EPUB with no images whatsoever, or EPUB where the only image was a cover, what was discovered is that there were actually triple the amount that, well, actually are entirely textual because they don't have any images, or the only image is a cover. So that's another good example of something that couldn't be sent in ONIX before, that can be sent now. It's also a good example of something that matters a whole lot. This is one of the most important metadata you can send. And it's also a good example that by looking at the contents prior doing additional work, there are actually quite a few books that should have that metadata, but do not have that metadata today. And if we go actually one step, so if you add those two numbers up, it means you have about 20% of publications that are entirely textual. So 80% left. Oh, that's a lot. So am I going to have to do work on those 80% titles left? Do I need to have like long description on those 80% of EPUB left? Well, the thing is, we don't really know. We don't really know because there's not a lot of numbers out there. There's not a lot of people who've looked into the exact work you need to do with those remaining 80% titles. And there's one thing that I think needs to be reminded at all times is yes, you need to add descriptions, but you need to add a description to non-decorative images. So images that convey a meaning. But if you actually look at most images in, for example, novels, you'll see what? You'll see logos, you'll see a flower at the beginning of a chapter, you know, something that is not necessarily meaningful to convey something in the text. And we don't really know if in those 80% remaining publication, 50% of them have actually only decorative image, or 20. So my next advice would be, this is really something I think all publishers should look into right now for your entire backlist. Like, don't wait for 2 or 3 years or whatever. And I think there are actually a few things you can do to do that. If you have a book with super small image, or if you have a book where there are very long or very large images, or if you always have the same logo because, yeah, it's my brand, I put it everywhere. Or if you have a template, because a lot of publishers use templates. I mean, that makes sense. All of those things are more likely to be decorative images. And automatically detecting those, and then having a human, because you always need a human in the loop, checking, making sure that, yes, we can actually get away with those images. That's a very good way to start on this journey of making your backlist accessible. And what's very likely to happen there is that you'll end up with some books where you have 0 non-decorative images. And when that's the case, well, you can also send the information that they're entirely textual. Another key advice here, I think that really matters a lot, is that while you're making that work, it needs to be very clear whether an image is decorative or not. And then the typical implementation we see right now of decorative images is an empty alt. So one could assume that this is enough information. But when you have an empty alt, you can always ask yourself a question whether this was done on purpose, or this was just a mistake, or they forgot about the alt description. So what I would really, really recommend doing instead of this thing that everyone is doing right now is you can actually also include a role that clearly says this is presentation. So this is not going to break any reading system, I can assure you. So it's safe, but it also helps a lot moving forward, because once you've identified clearly decorative images, this will make your job easier once you have to do the remaining work. So once again, a few key advice. Identify books with no images, send metadata in EPUB and ONIX once again. Detect decorative images. I mean, I just gave a few examples, but I think there are a few others too. And disambiguate how you do that.
Thank you. Second example, second use case, when it comes to visual adjustment, also known as display transformability, it's defined as the possibility for the user to modify the appearance of text and page layout according to possibilities offered by the reading system. It's up to the reader to know what the reading system is capable to do. I know at least one reading system that allows you to set up any color you want, so you can read on pink text on green background, or you can even read on black text on black background, but I doubt it may be of use for someone. In October 2023, in the numbers given by Hadrien, there was less than 3% of files claiming to afford that functionality, which is clearly too few. Since then, we have no way to express that in ONIX, and we'll think we have ways to infer that metadata from file analysis too. So, display transformability is defined by the DAISY knowledge base, as a publication that does not restrict the ability of users to modify the display of text content, textual content. And two ways are proposed to achieve that. First, all text content must be encoded as text. Well, no image of text. I guess it's a vast majority of the actual ebooks on the market. So that should be easy to find. The second requirement is that absolute length units are not used for styling, which is, to me, part of the main bookmaking instruction for every book designer. Even in paper, we use EM, Quadratin for the French speakers. So that also should not be a real problem. And that is detectable by CSS analysis. Rules have to be discussed, but it's a possibility. Now that we have an inference rule, we can document displayed installability feature for new publication. We can now do that in ONIX, we can do that in EPUB. And it will also probably be quite simple to make a short script to analyze, perform analysis and review back catalog and infer that metadata in a quite quick way. With that two examples, we see that easy action can have high impacts. And today we can perform that kind of action thanks to valuable open source tools that exist, namely EPUBCheck for conformity, Daisy Haze and Smart for evaluation and reporting, the knowledge base for technical documentation. If you don't already use those tools, well, go and get them and start to use them. But for a fully accessible future, we think that the open source community has the role to play to provide more tools. We think about visualizers to help with the identification of errors and the human validation. We think about wizards to help you find most probable errors. You cannot automate everything, but you can help the human get the good information before. We see file enhancers for hassle-free manipulation. Sometimes code might be frightening for some of us, and also even manipulating code is maybe a hassle. So it's good to have ways to do that easier. With the an attention particular to be done on contextualized generative model. A lot of things are happening on this topic today, but how do we make sure that the generated text get context and can be more precise? And last but not least, publisher-readable documentation to help knowledge appropriation, mostly by non-technical collaborators and stakeholders.
Aha, big surprise. So 2 years ago, I was actually also invited by EDRLab to speak about Readium. And so I think you've heard about Readium already from Laurent. So everyone associates Readium with reading. And 2 years ago when I did the presentation, one of my last slides was, what if Readium was about more than reading? What if we could build, on top of the Readium technology, other tools that could be of use? And the good news is, actually all the numbers that I've showed you today, that I worked on mostly last year, all of those on the EPUB side of things were obtained with a tool actually built on the Readium toolkit. So up until now, you needed to be kind of geeky. You need to be able to go on a repo and, oh, I'm going to get the Go toolkit and I'm going to be building Golang or whatever. And yeah, I mean, that's useful, but it's not so easy for people to get access to that kind of tool. The good news now is that if you go on the URI right over here, or just use the QR code that's also available, you get to the repo, but now you can straight up download a binary, kind of like you can get a binary for other tools, and you can use that to automatically extract metadata or any structural information from your EPUB, but you can also do some minimal inferences. So this is something that we believe could be useful for publishers. So we've established that publishers put more metadata right now in their EPUB than in their ONIX, which probably means they have more metadata in the files than their own database. Well, publishers could use that to get that information back, put it back in the database, and hopefully then push it to ONIX. If you're a distributor or an aggregator, kind of the same thing. This could also be useful. You're a content producer, this could also prove useful. So the idea here is that we can build tools that are useful for the entire ecosystem on top of reading technology. So this one, it's outputs JSON, so it's not the sexiest thing you can do, but it is useful in the sense that not only does it give you quick access to accessibility metadata, any metadata, but it can also infer a few. So here you have an example. I used, I think, a test book that was WCAG AA, but the book failed to mention that it actually has page navigation. It also fails to mention that it actually has a table of content, both of which are useful, both of which you want to display to the user. So that type of tool is capable of doing that. And we really hope this is just the first step. There are a lot of tools that are needed, some of them that were pointed out by Gautier. But that's also why open source matters, why open source can be useful. It's not just for people implementing reading apps somewhere in the dark. You can use them for those kind of stuff. Which kind of brings us to our last slide of recommendation. There are a number of tools out there. Those tools are open sourced. Those tools are available for free. Add them to your workflow and make them mandatory. So it's nice to have them on the side, but we've reached a point where they shouldn't be on the side. They should be at every single step that you need them. So they have to become mandatory. Tools are not magic. Tools won't do your job, but they might give you additional information. They might make your job easier. So it's very important to really be aware of what's available and use them. Second one, last but not least, a very important one, I think, you also need to support organization maintain these tools. So EDRLab does that, Daisy does that. Those organizations need your membership, or when those organizations are looking for additional funds, well, it's important, I think, for the community to show up. The only way we'll achieve a fully accessible backlist is by having shared tools built on top of open source by organizations that are well-funded. So we've seen in the past situation where organizations were struggling to maintain some of those tools due to the lack of funding. A one-off gesture is nice, but being members of those organizations and supporting them on an annual basis matters even more. And if you have developer resources, that works too. They're open source. Just do a PR, just give a bit of your time. That's also another way you can contribute. And as Gautier has mentioned, I think we're missing a lot in that toolbox. I think there are a lot of things to explore. I just spent 2 days listening to bright people from the Daisy board talking about bleeding edge stuff regarding TTS and read aloud, and that kind of stuff is also useful for a lot of people out there, not just for creating Daisy books. This is useful if you want to, look into automated production of audiobooks or automated production of media overlay or that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot that is currently missing in the toolbox. But we need organizations, we need individuals to group together and build those things together. Because, I think that's the only path forward, that's the only way we can get to this fully accessible future. And that's all for today. Hope the recommendations were useful.
Are there maybe any questions for Hadrien and Gautier? Any questions in the room?
Hi, thanks for your presentation. You told about the possibility to infer metadata from looking at the files, analyzing them. What I'm very curious about, there's a lot of ONIX fields to be filled. I think something about 100. Are there certain things you cannot infer, and what are the most interesting things to look at, new technologies to do that as well? Because a publisher, of course, needs to fill in everything, and at the moment a lot of publishers have no clue, if I talk to them, how to do that. So if they get already 90%, that would be great, but what are the real missing things?
So I think you need to be careful when you work with inferences. And it's always a balancing act. I use an example of the table of content. So if you detect a table of content, then you can assume, there is a table of content. But the tool itself says nothing about the quality of the table of content. And it's very hard to assess that automatically, because there are books where it's legitimate to only have one or two items in the table of content. And then there are other books where you should probably have a very deep, with structured table of content. So I think this is one of the very clear limitations. Those things are not yes or no. There's a lot to explore in between. So that's where you have limitations. There are also a number of things that, and I think there's also a lot of experience in the accessibility space with testing. And at least for those of us familiar with accessibility testing, everyone knows that automated testing only gets you so far. It doesn't get you to 100. It doesn't even get you to 50%. But even if it only gets you to 10% or 20% of the way, it's better than being stuck at 0 or 5. So I think that's kind of the way we need to think about those capabilities. I think by being a bit, so the things that have been inferred so far were really basic, like is something present or not. I think there are possibilities to go beyond that, of course. But in many cases, I think human control will remain necessary. I don't think AI is about replacing humans. I think it's about facilitating the job of humans. And then sometime we're being sold something, oh yeah, it's going to do the work for you. No, I don't think that's the case. But yes, I think maybe it's hard to say exactly how much, but one can hope that with additional capabilities, maybe it won't be 20%, but 30%, or maybe it'll just be faster to do some of the things you need to do. And yes, in that direction, I think there's quite a lot that can be explored and improved to go to 100%.
Thank you. I think we'll need to end this session here in order to stay on schedule, but if there are more questions, you are more than welcome to ask them at the lunch break. Thank you, guys.